Colleagues, could I ask screens on, please? Welcome to the 7th meeting of City Council. This is a virtual meeting during the COVID-19 emergency. We would ask that you check the city website for current details of COVID-19 service impacts. Meetings can be viewed via live streaming on YouTube and the city website. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council standing or advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. Colleagues, I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. With respect to item 2.6 in the Community and Protective Services, the outdoor burning bylaw, I'll declare conflict as one of the teams in my division at the health unit provides routine advice to council and to the city on this matter. And there's a couple identifications of potential funding impacts to the Middlesex London Health Unit in this SPPC agenda. There's no funding implications directly in that, so there's no conflict, but I do raise it just so that I identify what there might be an issue with at some point.
So noted. Thanks very much. Any other disclosures? Thank you. Seeing none. We do have a recognition. I'd like to call on Councillor Pelosi, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Ramadan is an Islamic holy month, which runs from April 12th to May 12th this year. Ramadan is a time for daytime fasting and spiritual reflection and a chance to spend time with family and friends. Once again this year, we can't do that with COVID-19 stay-at-home orders. This past Friday, many of our community, interfaith leaders, and members from our political community gathered on behalf with Muslims with the London and Forest City Muslim magazine, and we held a virtual iftar dinner. Following that dinner, we broke the fast together, and this was an opportunity to come together and celebrate the common heritage of three Arabic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and taking advantage of being together while apart. So to our Muslim friends, neighbors, brothers, and sisters, Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you, Councillor. I am not aware of any confidential matters to be considered public, but if I turn your attention then to item 4, the council in closed session, as we do in these meetings, we will move that to after stage 13 bylaws. So for that, I would like to change the order and I would require a motion to move item 4 and 7th report of council to after stage 13. Moved by Councillor Van Hol, seconded by Councillor Pelosi. Thanks very much. Let's call the vote.
Councillor Helmer?
I vote manually, yes.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14-0.
Thank you, colleagues. I'll look for a motion being held April 13th, 2021 and put that on the floor. Is there a mover, please? Councillor Van Meerbergen, seconded by Councillor Lehman. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14-0.
Thank you, colleagues. that we'll deal with in one motion because we're going to move them to the appropriate committee. Under 6.1, 4 items to relating to item 7, 2.3 of the 7th report of Community and Protective Services Committee, the 2020-2021 Winter Response Program for Unsheltered Individuals. 1 related to item 8, which is 2.5 of the 7th report of Community and Protective Services Committee having to do with homeless prevention funding received in 2020, 2021, and COVID-19 response. We have 5 items related to item 12.4.1 of the 7th report of the Community and Protective Services Committee relating to the animal bylaw PH3. And we have 1 item related to item 8, which is 3.3 of the 6th report of the Planning and Environment Committee having to do with the addresses 1918 to 2304 and 2005 to 2331 Kaleli Road. I'll look for a mover to put those in the appropriate areas. Thank you, Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Hillier. Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 14-0.
There are no motions to which notice has been given. So we'll now turn to item 8, which are the reports, and we start with the 7th report of Community and Protective Services. Councillor Helmer, please.
I'm happy to put the whole report on the floor with the exception of the items that colleagues have indicated they want to have pulled. So Councillor Turner indicated some conflicts, and Councillor Van Holst and Councillor Lewis had circulated a motion. So if we just pull those items, the one that they circulated the motion on is the winter response to support people experiencing homelessness. And then Councillor Turner's conflicts.
All right, so again, I'm just looking at the items under the agenda and wanted to be sure that we have those items that are so noted, if I could. Items 5 and item 7. Thanks very much. Anyone wish to deal with any other items separately? Back to you, Councillor Helmer.
Just what I want to say in general about these items is draw your attention to the administrative monetary penalties bylaw changes. There's a lot of bylaws there that are impacted by adding administrative monetary penalties. I think that's going to be a good step forward in terms of the efficiency of that area and taking a bit of the burden off the provincial offenses court, where otherwise these kinds of fines and charges would go for resolution. And that's a big step forward. I want to commend Mr. Katolik in his area for bringing that forward after many years of working on administrative monetary penalties. You'll see there's lots of substantial progress reported out in many of these reports, which are to be received for information, especially when it comes to the coordinated informed response. Something we started a couple of years ago, and that has, yes, you read the numbers, the scale of that program, and the amount of work that's being done by the individuals who are working in that area every single day of the year. Definitely to be commended, and lots of great work done in that area.
Thank you. Any other comments on all of those non-pulled items? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 14-0.
Back to you, Councillor Helmer.
Okay, I'll put the amendments to the open bylaw on the floor. This is the one that Councillor Turner had declared a pecuniary interest on.
Comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 14 with 1 recuse.
Thank you. Back to
Yeah, I'll put item 7, which is 2.3 from the committee report. This is the update on the winter response to support unsheltered individuals, basically from Christmas until the end of April. And the recommendation is to extend a couple of those locations until the end of June. The committee had a good discussion about that, supported that recommendation with some direction added on to staff to come back with a report about what's going to happen after June and what have we learned from the winter response that we might want to continue past June 30th. So that's the recommendation from the committee. I do want to say that although there certainly were some difficulties in rollout of the overall program and not everything was perfect, overall this response over the winter was very well done and has resulted in dozens of people making their way into housing and finding some stability over the time that the winter response was up and running. So I think it's very important that we take stock of that program. I know that was a lot to mobilize in a very short period of time, both for the staff of the city who are working on it, mobilizing all of the trailers and the physical locations, and all the staff who are working at the community level in the WISH Coalition and other partners to make those spaces, get them up and running, staff them, and have them be as successful as they were. One of those locations was in my ward, not too far from where I am sitting right now. And I know that there were some challenges in terms of some of the impacts on the neighborhood. But I think even among folks in the neighborhood, there were a lot of people very happy to see that people were getting the transition they're making from that location that was wound down was into a more stable housing situation and not back out onto the street. So I think that was a very, very well done by everybody involved on that front. Put it on the floor.
Thanks very much. I'll invite any questions or comments colleagues might have. Councillor Van Holst.
There we are. Thank you, Your Worship. And I just direct colleagues' attention to the motions, the amendments that Councillor Lewis and I prepared for the agenda package. It's on 118 of the original agenda package. And I'd like to put that amendment on the floor. But before I do, I'll note that B, which is to endorse the extension of the Hamilton Road Senior Center, although that could be approved so that it's going forward for another 8 weeks, or could be not approved, so that means go forward for 0 weeks. I just wanted to, through you, to go to staff to see if there might be another option.
Before we do that, you're looking to put a motion on the floor. Do you have a seconder? Councillor Lewis. I'll come back to you now. Councillor Van Holst, specifically, would you ask again, please?
Okay, so I would put these on the floor, but I wanted to check before I do if there might be an option other than B that I could also put on. So just through you to staff, we could ask if there might be another option there in terms of the extension of the Hamilton Road Warming Center.
I actually would think that that would come from you, Councillor Van Holst, as opposed to from staff. So I might ask you perhaps to be a bit more prescriptive in either what you're asking or what you're proposing, please.
Okay, Your Worship, then if that's the case, the warming center is intended to be extended until June 30th. But I would note that the lockdowns are intended to end on May 20th. And of course, the activities of the senior center are important as well. So my question to staff is it possible to reopen the senior center for its regular purposes at the end of the lockdowns?
I think that might go to Mr. Dickens.
Thank you. And through you, Your Worship, the staff recommendation, as you've noted, is
Mr. Dickens, I'm getting tremendous feedback from your presentation. You and everyone is speaking. It feels like either lower the volume or there may be some adjustment might need to be made at your end, if you would, please, sir.
Sorry, Your Worship, is it any better?
Modestly. Whispering may have the same effect, I'm not sure.
Well, I will attempt to do this through you, Your Worship.
Now we can't hear you. I didn't mean that, actually. So you might just speak up a touch, please.
Thank you, and through you, Your Worship. The staff recommendation is to continue the Hamilton Road drop-in day space through to the end of June. Should council wish not to extend it for that period of time, that is certainly their decision to make. To the question from Councillor Van Holst, there certainly is a provincial stay-at-home order that is in place. And if council is directing us to change the length of time at the day space, we could make that consideration.
Councillor Van Holst?
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. Well, that means I'll put on the floor then the motion that the length of the extension be tied to the length of the lockdowns. And if there's somebody that would second that motion, that could replace B.
I'm going to go to the clerk.
Through Your Worship, the recommendation from the committee was to extend for Hamilton Road. When I spoke with the councillor about this motion, I separated Hamilton Road out so that if he wished to vote against it, he could. But that's what you'd have to do at this point, because the recommendation from the committee is to extend for Hamilton Road.
So to be clear, clerk, what that would mean is that even though we can vote on an item separately, it would have to be defeated to consider an alternate? To remove Hamilton Road from the committee recommendation. Back to you, Councillor Van Holst.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's clear. And of course, that's the process that we've seen many times. So anyway, we understand that there may be a motion at this point. I think that would be part of the main motion. So the amendment that's being put on the floor is essentially D, which is directing staff to do some extended cleanup of needles in the area in support of the community.
I just want to be clear, Councillor Lewis, is that clear from your understanding? Go ahead, please.
Yes, Your Worship. That was my intent in seconding, was that Part D would be added as an amendment for the expanded cleanup area for these warming centers.
Thanks very much. Councillor Van Holst, you still have the floor if you wish any other comments.
Okay, well, thank you, Your Worship. And so the issue of needles has become quite a large concern to the community, in as much as this is located very close to a school, and the community themselves had put together a team to go around and do the cleanup that although it was happening on the specific site, was not happening where there are many needles, hundreds of needles in the surrounding area. And since this was considered by them to be the source, at least a major source of the challenge, we're looking to support the community by extending the sweep of the needle cleanup that's being done by staff.
Thank you. Councillor Squire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be happy to support the amendment. It makes sense. But I just wanted to ask staff about a broader sort of concept here, and it pertains to what will be done under Clause E, which is looking towards the future. And it would seem to me that part of the learning process from how a warming center is working in a given community would be to talk to the community, hear back from the community, and interact with the community as to what they thought worked really well, what they think didn't work well, changes that could be made. And it seems to me that's what the community is sort of reaching out for and hoping for, is that there will be some kind of interaction both ways, so that we can continue on with the valuable resource that warming centers are, while also making sure that they work well with the community. And I think if they do work well with the community, then they're going to get community support. So for my clarity, I just want to see what we're looking at going forward in terms of reviewing what we've learned, interacting with the communities, and seeing if we can do even better next year than we did this year.
Mr. Dickens.
Thank you, and through you, your worship. We appreciate that question. Certainly, we have learned lots during the winter response. Certainly, what location means for those surrounding the winter response and what location means for those accessing the winter response. When we move forward with what a community plan looks like beyond the month of June, certainly we will be consulting with our many service provider networks. And if we were to look at something that's more long-term in nature, again, reflecting on the winter response being an emergency response, get something up quickly, do it well, keep people alive during the coldest months of the year. If we were to do something more calculated, strategic, and longer term, absolutely, it starts with community consultation. And we've learned that the community can be very supportive for emergency responses, but we also know that we ask a lot of our community when we perform those type of services. So to answer your question, yes, as we move forward, as we do with all of our plans, the community engagement and consultation is critical to the long-term success of those plans.
Thank you, Councillor Squire.
And I think that certainly should be comforting to the people who live in the area, who I can see from their correspondence want to support what we're doing, but also want to raise their concerns. And I think that's entirely possible, and that's something we should be doing. And it looks like Mr. Dickens is committed to doing that. So good work by staff, and thanks to the community for bringing those concerns forward, because I think they'll just inform what the response is going to look like in the future.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Sorry, Your Worship, I don't think I had my hand up.
I see a little hand on your screen. I don't know. It's just to, when I look at it, it's to your left, and to me it's to the right. I'm going to get the clerk to confirm my eyesight.
That's your cursor.
We're going to ignore, you didn't hear that, did you? Councillor Turner, that's enough. Thank you. If we can't bring a little levity to these, okay, I'll see if I can get my cursor closer to someone else next time. Anyone else for discussion? Councillor Lewis, please. Without a cursor.
Thank you, Your Worship. And after we adjourn, if you want me to adjust your cursor settings for you so they don't appear as a hand, I'll happily do that. I seconded the amendment proposed by Councillor Van Holst because I think it is an important acknowledgement on our part to the community that we've heard their concerns and that this has been an emergency response. This response was not something that we had a lot of time to put thought into in location choices, and the other locations that we did consider weren't appropriate and we're going to require quite a bit of work to make them appropriate. It just wasn't going to fit within the emergency response program parameters. But what we've done is we've located a resource that is needed, but we've located it in an area that was not sort of purpose designed or built for it. And so that has created some spillover beyond the property itself into the community. And so I think it is important that we do acknowledge those concerns and that we do give our administration some direction to take some extra steps to address those with some additional sweep for needles and other paraphernalia that's spilling over into the neighborhood and creating some community concerns. So I hope people will support this. I think we did the best job that we could have in a situation that required an immediate response. However, I think there have been some learning opportunities through this, and I think that this is one of those, is that when we locate these centers, and I heard Mr. Dickens reference that location means different things to both the neighborhood and the clients utilizing the space. And so we'll take that lesson forward as we look at longer term solutions. But I think that this is a good way to recognize the community's concerns and take some action that will give them some reassurance that they're being heard by us, as well as addressing the need to keep the warming center going for a little while longer.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I wonder if we could ask Councillor Helmer, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something. So I think reading the language in the motion that this would be not just on public property, but also onto private property. And I'm sure many colleagues have experienced this kind of problem in different parts of the city. Certainly I have in various parts of Ward 4, where the issue of discarded syringes is not a new one, nor is the issue of it being discarded inappropriately on private property. And I could imagine that if we start doing this sort of thing in around the day space here, that there will be no shortage of other requests for the same kind of service in other parts of the city. And one of the reasons I know that is because I talk to staff about this regularly, and this is something that is an ongoing issue for business owners and property owners all over the place. So I wonder if we could just clarify, we are talking about with permission going onto private property, and how will we, because I support the idea in this specific circumstance, I think it's needed and I think it'll be helpful. But when we have other requests, how are we going to handle those as they come in for other areas?
Mr. Dickens?
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you. I believe the question was to clarify if the motion is speaking to private property cleanup. So I might go to the mover to answer that question first.
Then let's go to the mover. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Your Worship. And the answer to that is yes. So that sweep of around 100 meters would cover the area, which is really the heart of the Hamilton Road urban regeneration, and it's where the majority of the concerns would be. And I think if staff took that took on those sweeps, which some community members are doing now because they feel it's important to protect their young ones. I think that would be an excellent gesture on our part. So that's what I'm looking for. And where it says undertake a sweep within 300 meters, essentially, if there's problems with needles in a particular place, we have, for instance, Smith Street has become a route between the senior center and the river and the Thames Valley Parkway, and that's a place where people are experiencing an added amount of these discards, and I think it's reasonable to help them with those as well. So that would address many of the community's concerns. I think that addressing in this way would be well worth it.
Councillor Helmer?
Yeah, I guess my remaining question is just for Mr. Dickens, which is when other requests come in for similar kind of service in other parts of the city, how would you like us to handle those?
Mr. Dickens.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, I will actually ask Mr. Kotsovis to answer this question. This falls within the bylaw team and the contracted services they use for public and some private property cleanup and needle sweeps. So he'll be better positioned to speak to that question about what happens when requests come in across the city.
Let's go to Mr. Kotsovis.
Through Your Worship, I think in this particular instance, there'll be a council direction for us to do so, and we could do it through the council direction. And what it would likely be is a program where we might sweep that limited area a few times a week, and it would be primarily public property, but where private property, where there's needles visible through the sweep. So we won't be necessarily going onto every private property in their backyards and things like that. It would be just where it's visible from the street where we can do the pickups. But again, this would be through a council direction, and I think that would probably be the most appropriate means for future requests.
Councillor Elmer?
That's it for me for now. Thanks.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, thank you. I do have a couple questions just for further clarification, and this is on the D and just a better understanding, trying to understand if we are just speaking here to Hamilton Road specifically and only as it relates to D picking up the needles. I would like clarification on that. And I'd also like to have a better understanding if we do go forward with if it's just relates to Hamilton Road in D, and I think it's fair to say that this area may need some extra help in getting everything cleaned up. The concern is around the private property part. And if I appreciate Mr. Kostof's comments that if they see it, they will pick it up. But what are we specifically doing with D? Are we asking for further information for staff to report back on public and private property? So 2 questions. D, does it relate just to Hamilton Road? And are we also looking for a report for all areas in communities that may need cleaning up with a report back?
Well, I'll go back to the mover on that, but it seemed to me D was dealing specifically with Hamilton Road. But go ahead to Councillor Van Holst, please.
Yes, Your Worship. Although the motion does say it's those warming centers that are to remain open in 2021, and I think there are, I believe I can check with staff, I believe there are 2. And so if that's the case, the goal is to provide that similar service there as well. I can let staff talk to that. And then, of course, this is just for 2 months. And then after that, we're looking for staff to come back with, it could simply be part of the report that they had intended to bring back on learnings as a part of E. But there we are looking to tell us what specifically they would be doing for future warming centers or cooling centers.
Councillor Hopkins, does that answer your question?
Just a quick follow-up. May I have the other location that we are speaking to in D, other than Hamilton Road?
That would be Talbot Street.
Talbot Street.
I'll let staff give the exact address on that. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Mr. Dickens?
Yep, thank you. Through you, Your Worship, I believe the mover is referencing the extension of the York Street overnight space as the additional daytime space that we'd be referring to in this motion.
I may stand corrected, Councillor Van Holst. That was your recommendation?
Yes, those were those that are remaining open as warming centers.
I apologize, Councillor, for that confusion. Other questions from you?
Not for now.
All right, thank you. Other comments or questions? I'd ask the Deputy Mayor to take the chair, please.
Yep, and I have the mayor on the list.
Thanks very much. I'm prepared to support D. And I appreciate Councillor Van Holst and Councillor Lewis and working through some of the machinations associated with this. I'd like to pay tribute to our staff. Mr. Dickens, your team has been exceptional in handling what has always been, I think, a trying circumstance, which has been compounded by COVID. And to deal with all of this, with the pressures that and responsibilities that you have, please, I know I speak for council when I say how important it is the work that you do. And yes, there will be lessons learned. Yes, there will be things that will be done as we approach our next winter, and how we deal with resting spaces and how we deal with other sites as those circumstances come up. But I think right in the here and now, I think it's appropriate that we say well done under very trying circumstances. That's it for me, Deputy Mayor.
I'll pass the chair back to the mayor. I have no one else on the speakers list so far.
Thanks very much. I don't see anyone else on the speakers list. So we are dealing with the amendment as indicated. Councillor Hopkins, you have a question about what we're voting on?
Yeah, I'm always looking for some clarification here. Fortunately, I didn't watch the committee meeting, so I am trying to understand what the committee
No, that's fine.
recommendation is.
So if what you're asking is what it is that we're voting on, because you have had the opportunity to speak, I'll go to the clerk and just clarify precisely what it is that we're dealing with.
Through Mr. Mayor, the motion that's on the floor is to amend item 2.3 by adding a following new Part D. For those warming centers that are to remain open in 2021, the Civic Administration be directed to make the necessary arrangements to, where permission is granted, regularly sweep for needles in the area within 100 meters of the warming center, and when requested to do so, to undertake a sweep for needles within 300 meters of the warming center, and to report back to a future meeting of the Community and Protective Services Committee on the implementation of similar actions for future warming and cooling centers.
Thanks very much. Colleagues,
Your worship, if I may, just
if
as a follow-up.
if it relates specifically to clarification what we're voting on. Go ahead, Councillor.
So I have a proposed amendment that is A to E that I'm looking at, and I do appreciate the clarification given that we are just dealing with D at the moment. So thank you for that.
Clerk, I wonder if that requires any clarification.
Through Mr. Mayor, just to clarify, the communication from the councillor, I believe, and Councillor Van Hulst, if I'm misinterpreting, I believe that you're now just moving forward with adding a Part D, and that is all you're doing at this point, and that you're not completely, you're not doing A, B, and the others that are in there at this point, that you're just amending the clause to add the new Part D.
All right. The clerk says this is primarily a renumbering, Councillor, just for purposes of, but the primary change based on this amendment is that has been directed and moved by Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Lewis. Councillor Lewis only, Councillor Van Holst, no commentary on the pleas on the, but if you want to bring a little bit of clarity to what we're voting on. I thought it was clear, but go ahead and please be precise.
Yes, thank you. So A together with B are the committee recommendation. It's just they're separated in two spots. So during the main motion, we could separate B out later, but it doesn't have an effect on the amendment. The only thing that's being done substantively here is that we're adding D.
Thanks very much. We'll call the question.
Ms. Westlake Power, just to clarify, we're just looking for the vote on the new Part D to be put on the floor. Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
The original motion now is amended. I'll need a mover, please. Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Helmer. Any comments or questions? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I'm going to ask that Part B, which is the endorsement of the extension for the Hamilton Road Center to June 30th, be separated out for individual vote.
So noted. Any other comments or questions? So if the mover and seconder are good with all of the items with the exception of B, that's the item. All those items with the exception of B are what we're voting on now. So with that, we'll call the question. Councillor Helmer, you had a question before we vote?
I just want to make sure everybody's referring to the same thing. Councillor Lewis and Councillor Van Holst, in the amendment that they circulated, they had a Part A, which was everything except Hamilton Road, and a Part B, which was just Hamilton Road. The committee recommendation has one recommendation, which is just Part A. And there is a Part B, which has nothing to do with, it's the administration executing all the things they need to do. So I want to make sure we're voting on, I think what Councillor Van Holst is asking for is for A to be separated into A and B, so he can then vote against that new B. I just want to make sure that that is what is happening.
That's correct. So clerk, for the benefit of all of us, just clarify for this purpose here with that separation as has been noted. Do we just clarify for the benefit of council the items we're dealing with right now, please?
Mr. Mayor, I believe, and I'm speaking with Ms. Westlake Power, who's remote in another room. My understanding is what we're going to be putting on the floor is the lead-in. It might be easier if I just read it. So what would be on the floor is that on the recommendation of the acting managing director, Housing, Social Services, and Dearness Home, the following actions be taken with respect to the staff report dated April 20th, 2021, related to the update on the City of London's 2020-2021 Winter Response Program for unsheltered individual. What would be on the floor with that is A, that the above noted staff report be endorsed and be approved with the exception of matters related to the Hamilton Road Senior Center located at 525 Hamilton Road. And then the next part would be that the civic administration be directed to undertake all administrative acts which are necessary in relation to the above noted work. And then the civic administration be directed to report back to the Community and Protective Services Committee as soon as possible on additional actions that could be taken after the end of June, building on what we have learned from the temporary winter response to support people who are experiencing homelessness. That's what would be on the floor currently.
Any comments or questions about what is on the floor now? And then I'll have the clerk take us through the other items as well as we vote on them to be sure. Councillor Hopkins?
Thank you. I'm looking for clarification again. So if I'm not supportive of, I understand there's another amendment coming forward here. So not supporting A, would that be contrary?
Clerk?
Through Mr. Mayor, any member of council has the option of voting against a motion that's on the floor, if that's what the question is.
Was that your question, Councillor Hopkins?
Yes.
Thank you. And the other, Councillor Cassidy.
Sorry. So this is not the recommendation that's coming from committee. Is this a brand new motion? I'm extremely confused now.
I'm going to go to the seconder, but actually then I'm going to go to Ms. Westlake Power because we're making this a little more confusing than we need to be, colleagues. But go ahead, Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. Hopefully I can make this really clear for folks. What we're doing is supporting the committee recommendation as amended. However, Councillor Van Holst would like to be able to vote against the extension at the Hamilton Road Senior Center, so he's asked for that to be separated into an A and a B so we can support the rest of the extensions. Then if you want to support the Hamilton Road extension, you support B as well. A contrary motion would not be able to be brought forward unless B is defeated. So if you want to support the whole thing, support the whole thing. If you want to not support the extension of the Hamilton Road Senior Center, you would vote against B.
Clerk?
Through Mr. Mayor, I understand the concern that the councillor is raising. So it would be best to put all of it on the floor so that when they're voting, it's clear that the Hamilton Road is also on the floor. And then the councillor can ask for that part to be just called separately. And then, so A and B together would be the same as what the committee had recommended. Is that helpful?
Well, I was kind of with you for a moment there, Clerk, but Ms. Westlake Power, can you bring clarity, please?
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship, I cannot bring clarity. I just wanted to indicate that what is loaded into eScribe and the members should be able to see on their screen is a motion that is the approval of clause 2.3, excluding the Hamilton Road location. And then another motion, which would be subsequent to the one that's currently on the screen in the chambers, that would be to approve the part B of clause 2.3 as amended. If there's something different, then I will revise what's entered into the system.
So Ms. Westlake Power, you're talking about 2 votes then for clarity.
That was my understanding of the intent of separating out the Hamilton Road location.
You have Councillor Van Holst, you have a comment, not a comment, a question on what it is we're voting on?
Your Worship, I could myself try to provide some clarity to the council if, since I'm the one who requested the difference. So looking on the page that Councillor Lewis and I had forwarded, the staff, the clerks were kind enough to separate it into an A and B already, so that those 2 things together are the staff recommendation. And then when we got to this point, it'd be a simple matter of looking at these 2 and realizing that if you vote for A, you're supporting all the great work that has been done, except for the Hamilton Road. And then after we vote on this, we'll take up B, and then that will be just for Hamilton Road, where I'd like to make a little change. So I would vote against that and make a change. But if you vote this vote, and then in the next opportunity, vote for B, you will have supported the entire committee recommendation. But at any point, I can ask to have something separated out for a different vote. That's what I've done.
So we have A through E, we have B to be dealt with separately. And if you'll note, what we approved was in D, the amended motion, or the amendment, or the motion that was put forward by Councillors Van Holst and Lewis. So we'd be voting on all of that with the exception of B, unless there's any comments or confusion about what that is that we're voting on. It helps if you've got that all in front of you, obviously on page 3 of our report, and also the councillor's letter that went with this. So seeing none, Clerk, are we good with voting on this A through E with the exception of B?
Your Worship, I think it would be a lot easier if I read what's on the floor, just so people are clear.
Why don't you do that?
Okay, so currently what's on the floor, and if you refresh your screen, you'll see it. It's that clause 2.3 as amended be approved, excluding the reference to the Hamilton Road location as follows. That on the recommendation of the acting managing director, Housing, Social Service, and Dearness Home, the following actions be taken with respect to the staff report dated April 20th, 2021, related to an update on the City of London 2020-21 Winter Response Program for Unsheltered Individuals. A, the above noted staff report be endorsed and be approved with the exception of matters related to the Hamilton Road Senior Center located at 525 Hamilton Road. Part C, the civic administration be directed to undertake all administrative acts that are necessary in relation to the above noted report. And D is, because it's the amended motion, it's the D part that you've already approved. And then after this one, then we'll go back to the Hamilton Road clause.
Any other questions? Effectively voting on everything except B. So with that, we'll call the question.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor?
Before we
Yeah,
vote.
I do have a question on part A of the motion as to why it refers to not voting for the Hamilton Road part. If we're just separating it so that the councillor who wants to vote against it can vote against it, I don't see why we have to have a language that says that we're not voting for it.
I'm not sure that we're saying that, but clerk, do you want to add anything to that? And by the way, the vote is open, so colleagues, I'll just bear your indulgence on this.
Through your worship, in order to allow for a councillor to vote separately on Hamilton Road, we have to separate it out. If we left clause A the way it was, that would include Hamilton Road, which would not allow the councillor to vote separately on Hamilton Road.
The vote is open.
Councillor Kaibaga?
Yes, I just have one last question. Does this mean that it's going to come back as a motion and we can vote on it?
For clarity, do you mean, will there be another vote on Hamilton Road with the Hamilton Road in it? Yes, it'll be the next vote that goes on the floor.
Okay.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Let's go to B. The vote is now open. Councillor Van Holst, you have a question?
No,
about the, there's no comments here now, because this is, we're now in the voting stage. This is, we've already had our discussion on this, so did you?
Point of order, I separated this out so I could.
What's your comment?
Well, thank you, your worship. And so I wanted to say first that, you know, it's great that the warming center was able to achieve its primary objective of keeping people warm during the winter months. And regarding the extension for the location, you've heard from the residents, you've heard from the BIA. I've spoken to some people personally, so we don't really need to rehash the issue. However, what I would like to do in support of the residents who you know, are involved in this and have been helping out to quite a degree, and I think they're maybe experiencing a bit of caregiver burnout. So what I would like to do instead of extending this to June 30th is to simply have it extended to the end of the lockdowns. And then that provides them the opportunity to have their senior center back and move forward with the opportunities that would be available to other centers in the city.
I understand that, Councillor. That is contrary to the motion that's on the floor.
Yes, and so, your worship, so that that's why I'll vote against the extension, because I'm representing the people who have asked us to find a different approach. And so with that.
I have a point of order, Councillor Squire.
Councillor Van Holst is almost finished, but let me just make it clear. Just because you pull a matter and ask to vote on it separately does not give you, in my submission, another opportunity to speak. It just doesn't. And so to allow Councillor Van Holst to say, well, because I pulled this matter to vote on it separately, I want to speak on it again, is out of order.
Okay, well.
I will vote in support of Councillor Squire's comments. So that's it then for you, Councillor Squire. Thank you. Any other no other comments? This is on the floor, colleagues. This is a very clear yes or no vote.
Oh, darn it.
I think we need you on mute if I could, Councillor Van Holst. I hear some tapping.
Sorry about that.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14-1.
Thank you. Councillor.
That's it for me.
I think
Unless
it is.
we need to do it all together, but I don't think we did, since we did all the component parts.
That would be correct. So thank you for that, colleagues. Thanks for your indulgence. I know that was a little bit confusing. That's probably on me, but there was some twists and turns on that, so I appreciate your indulgence, all of you. So thanks very much. Colleagues, we'll now look to the seventh report of the Corporate Services Committee. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm not aware of any items that need to be pulled. Nobody has advised me.
Does anyone wish any item to be dealt with separately? Back to you, Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Your Worship. Two important parts in this were the tax policy and the education tax rates. We discussed both of those things in the past, and staff had recommended no changes to the tax ratios, which is what is in this bylaw going forward now today. Staff, civic administration, and specifically the city clerk's office had asked us to fill some of or to extend the terms of the advisory committees while that review is still ongoing till the end of December of this year. And that's what we did. And a number of the committees had vacancies. So we did fill some of those vacancies at committee, and those names are on this agenda, this report right now. The final important thing, it was all very important, but the final thing that I would comment on is that Councillor Morgan's letter is in here asking for support and endorsement from City Council to run again for the Board of Directors at FCM. There's a deadline that has to be met, and that's why Deputy Mayor Morgan's letter is on the added agenda for the Corporate Services Committee. That's all on the report for Council's consideration.
Thank you. Any comments or questions on Councillor Cassidy's report? Then as we wish good luck to Councillor Morgan, let's call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. And Deputy, as Councillor Lewis would have said, had I not preempted him, as we all wish you luck, may the 4th be with you. And if you look at his t-shirt, you know what that means. I'll now look to the 6th report of Civic Works and call on Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you, Your Worship. We had a very productive meeting. We discussed sewage overflows, waste, EAs, and pond expansions. The only item I've been asked to pull so far is number 11, being 2.5, update on resource recovery strategy, including mixed waste processing, unless there's others.
Does anyone wish anything else dealt with separately? I see none. Councillor Pelosi, back to you.
Thank you. I'll just have it note as well to a thank you to staff on item 2.3, sewage overflows and bypasses into the Thames River. Staff did present at committee a 15-minute report, very in-depth about what we do and why. as well as our water treatment facilities and UV disinfectants. So a great conversation, and I'll speak to item 2.5 when we get there.
Thanks very much. Any other comments or questions from colleagues? I see Councillor Turner with his hand, and it is not a cursor. Go ahead, please.
No, this one's really, Your Worship. Thank you. I just wanted to speak with respect to the number 2.3 presentation, a very informative presentation from staff, and helpful to provide some context to where we're at in the sewage overflows and bypasses work. You can see through some of the graphs in the presentation and in the report that we've actually over the past period of time shown there seen almost a 2/3 reduction in the amount of bypasses in untreated effluent that goes into the Thames River or partially. So that's a significant amount of work. There's been a number of things that have gone into that, including some of the sanitary and stormwater sewer separations, pumps, generator pump backups to the electrical systems on the pumping stations, and things like that. But there's still a lot of work to do, and the report highlights the one of the large contributors is the remaining unseparated sanitary storm system in downtown. It looks like we're going to be a little bit behind in that. What was supposed to be done in 4 years sounds like it could be double, maybe 8 or 9 years instead of the 4 years on the horizon identified there. And the Weeping Tile Disconnect program, there's 50,000 connections, and we've allocated about $1 million a year to this, which disconnects about 30 homes a year. So on 50,000, that's well, that's about 1,700 years of work ahead of us. You may recall during budget, I've talked to the storm or the sanitary sewer rates, and when we set them each year, the challenge of dropping them below that 3% increase means that we kind of short our funds and ability to be able to pay for a lot of this work that needs to be done. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us. It's good to have this report in context when we start talking about the budget in the coming year, and we take a look at the funding that we need to be able to support the sanitary and water charges. And but again, I just wanted to highlight that and thank staff for a very informative report to us.
So noted. Thank you, Councillor. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Your Worship. At the meeting, I had asked city staff for more information on how much of a contribution the City of London makes to the phosphorus loading into the eventually ends up in Lake Erie. And the information that I got back from staff was that what they identify is about 15% of the phosphorus loads are thought to originate from all of the urban sources along the major tributary, and the base year being 2008, London's 5 watershed tributaries contribution was about 43 tons a year, or 12.7% of the total phosphorus load. So I just wanted anybody that might have been watching the committee meeting and heard that question asked, that was the answer that I received from staff. So not insignificant. And as much as there is a lot of pollution happening upstream of London, we still have to do all that we can here in the city to keep it out of the Thames River as much as possible, because it is affecting not just our community, but especially the 3 First Nations who draw their drinking water from the Thames River, but all the way down into the communities in the US that are in the lower Lake Erie area.
Thank you for that, Councillor. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. And regarding item 11 or 2.5, the update on resource recovery strategy, including mixed waste processing. A couple things to ask about that. First, though, there was quite some detail gone into.
Your Worship, 2.5 was pulled for the councillor to speak to next.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Thank you.
Nope, you're good.
Any other comments or questions, colleagues? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you. Item 11 being 2.5 was the update on resource recovery strategy, including mixed waste processing. There was an A, B, and C in this report. We also dealt with an unsolicited proposal. This is looking at the city's long-term resource recovery strategy regarding mixed waste processing, advanced resource recovery, and the long-term resource recovery strategy. And it was Councillor Van Holst who requested to have this one pulled. I'll put it on the floor.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Worship, and also let me provide a belated thanks to staff for including the pedestrian crossings on Hamilton Road that are happening this year in the report on number 5. And I think that's what I'd hoped to comment on previously. But regarding this item, went into quite a bit of detail on the procurement policy. And I know that the province is putting some attention to that as well. And it seems like there may be some confusion in terms, certainly in my mind, in terms of what staff always means by a procurement. So will there be a time where that's defined a little better? There's, there's the idea of procurement in general, and then particular procurement policies and where we should and shouldn't be involved. So I wonder when, is there a time when some clarity to that will come forward?
I'll ask Ms. Scher to comment on the question.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I'll start, and Ms. Barbon might have something to add with respect to our general policies. With respect to this particular issue, we have issued in the past a request a request for expression of interest, and did receive, I believe it's around 28 expressions of interest. Based on that, we believe there's market demand from a number of potential suppliers, and we would recommend that we come back to you by the end of the year with a 2-step public procurement process. So an RF qual followed by a request for proposals that would specifically identify London's future relationship with a mixed waste processing service provider. In terms of the council role or with respect to procurement, I would suggest that Ms. Barbon and our friends in purchasing would have the best advice.
Councillor Van Holst, any other comments?
No, Your Worship, I think that would be fine. I appreciate the information. The only other point I wanted to make is with regarding some of the discussions on composting. And I think it's important to realize that there's multiple ways to use different technologies. And that's an example of one, just because it's a separation strategy. It's not necessarily a final product. It's interesting in my discussions with elements of the community and looking for a circular economy, speaking to the people who purchase composting, they said there's a use for any kind of compost. So although we think it needs to be A or double A or triple A, there are things that there are uses for compost that aren't necessarily for food. And so they can be of lower quality. And I recall, maybe a similar situation of only thinking along one line. And that was back with one of our first urban agriculture initiatives. We were looking to use some land near an industrial space in the East End. There's about 25 acres. And then the question came up, well, what if it was somehow contaminated? And then there all of a sudden became the burden of doing environmental assessments and soil testing, which would have cost a lot. So the project didn't go anywhere. But when in reality, we had people, and there was the possibility of simply doing some tree nursing there. So whether it was contaminated or not, growing some cedar shrubs on there as a means, another means of urban agriculture might have been a possibility if we'd thought about it. So I hope going forward we keep some other possibilities open in our mind. And thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I see no one on the list. I will call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. Councillor Below.
Worship, that concludes the sixth report of the Civic Works Committee.
Thanks very much. And speaking of sixth report of the Planning Environment Committee, I'll now turn it over to Councillor Squire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The first report, and the council will have the pleasure tonight of me presenting two reports, which I know is exciting, but the first one is the sixth report of the Planning and Environment Committee. The only matter that's been asked to be pulled is item number A3.3, which is clearly Southeast Basin environmentally significant area. And some of my colleagues will know we received some correspondence on that I will be asking staff to address.
Thanks very much. And anyone wish anything else dealt with separately? I'll turn it back to Councillor Squire.
I will put the balance other than item number A3.3 on the floor.
Comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Squire.
The next poll is number A3.3. With your indulgence, the question was circulated to council in the form of an email that they were asked to review. I took the liberty of forwarding that email to staff, and I wonder if they might now provide their response to that email to the council so that it can be part of their consideration going forward, Mr. Chair. And I think Mr. Barrett's prepared to do that.
Mr. Barrett.
Thank you. Through your worship, I'm not going to go to each of the points in the letter that's been added to your agenda. Probably just speak in general. I believe that there's a little bit of confusion in the nature of the letter and why it's brought forward in requesting the deferral. The reason why staff recommended the deferral on the Auburn lands was because they have there's a site-specific London plan appeal on those lands, and there isn't a similar appeal on the Fari lands. So for that reason, there would be no basis for the referral. Many of the points that they are making in their letter and the matters that they're asking would in fact be addressed through an EIS that would be submitted as part of any future development application. And there is at present no application on these lands. The recommendation in the staff report is to identify and zone the lands as environmental review, which in fact indicates that the evaluation has not been done to confirm the significance or not of those features, and to establish the boundaries of the feature, which is exactly what they're asking for. So at this point, it wouldn't be appropriate to be taking a position on that because none of that work has been done. So for that reason, this request that's in front of you is not at all like the request that came from Auburn, and the reason why staff had recommended the deferral on those lands. It was because the Auburn lands are subject to a site-specific London plan appeal, and the environmental matters would be something that would be addressed in addressing and dealing with that appeal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to put that matter on the floor. I hope that was of assistance to council.
Comments or questions? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. And through you, I do need some additional clarification from staff on this, because maybe if I'm missing something, hopefully staff can help clarify that. So whether there's an appeal or not an appeal on a site-specific London plan application, that would not change whether or not there is an environmental value that may be discovered through the environmental review. So how is the deferral that's been granted on one property changing the recommendation for the zoning and environmental review, but not changing the recommendation on the other property? And I ask this in part because it's also important to note that that when this item came before the Planning and Environment Committee, staff actually changed their own recommendation the day of the meeting. And originally, the lands that were deferred by the committee were not recommended for deferral, and then they were. So I'm not sure why I mean, I understand that there's an appeal on one piece of land, but if there's a communications problem, if there's confusion as a result of some of the communications, and it seems to me that the property that was not deferred certainly has some confusion over that. Why would it not be acceptable to simply refer this back, have staff meet with the applicant on the other piece of land and go over this with them before we proceed? Because I don't see how one is different from the other in terms of there's either an environmental value or there's not, regardless of the site-specific plan.
Mr. Barrett?
Thank you. Through your worship, the councillor's right. There's no difference in the environmental value on the lands. And the lands were identified on both parcels as environmental review and to be zoned environmental review as a result of the work that was done through the environmental impact study for the Kaleli Southeast Basin ESA. The reason why staff brought forward that amended recommendation at the committee was to defer the consideration on those lands, again, because of the site-specific appeal. It was as a result of communication between the solicitors involved in the London Plan appeals that noted that the lands, the Auburn lands, were subject to that appeal. And so the recommendation to apply the environmental review designation on those lands and to zone them environmental review was not appropriate given that outstanding appeal. And so because there is that appeal, there is that opportunity to sit down and work with the landowners to determine what the actual ecological and environmental significance is of those features. The issues that were identified by Mr. Ferrari on those lands were actually the same as the issues that were identified and part of the report by other adjacent landowners. In other words, they felt that more work should be done to determine the actual limits and significance of the feature. What staff's recommendation was that that work had not been done, and that's why staff were recommending that the lands be identified as the unevaluated patches and be left as environmental review for that subsequent work to be done. So that's what the recommendation was, and that's what the recommendation was for all of those lands. Were it not for the appeal on the Auburn lands, that recommendation would still have been and was the recommendation that was brought forward. It was as a result of the appeal being identified that staff brought forward that changed recommendation. What the councillor is asking for, that additional study, that in fact is what is done by having the lands identified as environmental review and is zoned that way. That future work will be done, and it would be done appropriately when there is a development application made on those lands. As I indicated, there isn't an application on those lands at this time.
Councillor Lewis?
So in follow-up to that then, I want to understand Mr. Barrett correctly. When the appeal, whatever the result of the appeal is finalized, then staff are going to be bringing forward another recommendation on that particular land to assess the environmental potential value on that site as well?
Mr. Barrett?
To the mayor, no, in fact, we won't. The board will have decided what that is. So that's why those lands are under appeal. So it's out of council's hands as it relates to those lands. They have appealed. Part of their appeal relates to the environmental significance and the nature of the environmental features on those lands. That's what would be dealt with at the board. So it's actually the board will decide. We will not be bringing it back to council on those lands.
Councillor Lewis?
Okay, I appreciate that. The reason I'm struggling with this is, to me, I want to make sure that we are treating all the property holders in this area fairly. And I'm getting the sense that there's a lot of confusion around the process, and I'm not laying blame for that in any way, shape, or form. It's not quite as simple as it seemed. Even the answers that I've gotten from Mr. Barrett tonight are helpful. However, I can understand why there's some question going around on the adjacent property right now. So I don't know if I have a seconder, but I think I would like to move a referral just for one cycle, ask staff to meet with the adjacent property owner, go through the process with them, make sure that they're clear on what that is, and then come back to us. And certainly, you know, I'm supportive of an environmental review going forward. I just want to make sure that the property owners are all treated fairly. So I'll see if I've got a seconder for a referral. I know folks want to, you know, not send back things to staff too many times, and I share that view. But I think that there might be just an opportunity here to provide clarification and remove any confusion before things move forward.
I see Councillor Hillier is seconding. Let's open this up to any comments or questions. I'm sorry, Councillor Lewis, I'll let you sit. Okay, great, thank you. I have Councillor Lehman, then Councillor Turner. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. And, you know, I think this should have been dealt with at committee level, but here we are. Through you, Chair, to staff, would the result of the appeal have any effect on, you know, the process started for the adjoining lands? And could it lead to further action by the adjoining lands that we did not give them due process if we were to, if the applicant was successful in their appeal on the other property?
Mr. Barrett.
Thank you. Through your worship, a couple of things. First of all, I want to clarify, we have actually already met with representatives of the adjacent landholders and explained the situation. Notwithstanding that, they said that they would be communicating with council. So they did tell us that this would be going forward with council. Also, there is no, the concern of due process, I think, is a little bit of a concerning term. Notice was provided, notwithstanding that they have said that notice was not received. We have records that the notice was sent. It was also published in the Civic Corner, as is the standard practice. And the matter, the EA matter, was actually addressed by council last year. So notice has been provided in this instance. We did hear from adjacent property owners who expressed the same concern. As I said, notwithstanding those concerns, what's in front of you is to actually put them in environmental review, which is where those concerns would be addressed. The adjacent property owner also in their letter, and that's why I said I wasn't going to get into it, but also indicates that in fact, permission to enter the property was not provided. And in fact, we do have a copy of the permission letter signed by the landowner to provide for the access. So there's probably records issues all around, but I can assure the council that notice was provided, and notice was provided in the paper, which is the legal notice, as well as the mail out notices that were given. Sitting down with the property owners for one cycle is not going to provide sufficient ecological and environmental information where we would be changing our position. Our position is that that information has to be provided through an EIS, and we're not going to get an EIS done that would change that position in one cycle of council. As it relates to the actions of the board are limited to the appeal that's in front of them. And that appeal that's in front of them is limited to the adjacent lands on the Auburn property. And that the outcome of that could identify and confirm the significance of the feature and the limits of the feature as it relates on that property. But that would then just be applied to that property. Subsequent environmental work would determine the limits and the extent of any ecological feature on the adjacent lands when that work was done.
Councillor Lehman.
Well, thank you. Again, through you, Chair. Will studies on the Auburn property still have to be done once the appeal process is finished? So I'm just having trouble understanding the need to expedite this thing. What are the time constraints? And because if we're going to have to do a study anyway on the Auburn property, these properties are side by side, and it's essentially the same property. Why would we want to proceed until we are sure that we have the grounds to to go ahead on the whole property as a parcel. So as not to duplicate efforts.
Mr. Barrett.
Thank you. Through your worship, again, just to clarify, we won't be doing any study. Any study would have to be done by Auburn to support their position before the board. So we're not compromising any timeline through this process. Auburn has the site-specific appeals. None of those appeals, the dates of those appeals have not yet been set. So Auburn, the timing of that is completely in their hands. This is not tying up anything or speeding anything up or slowing anything up. The Auburn has an appeal on those lands. The work that they would need to be, that they would do would be work that they would need to do to support their position at the board. And that would be the environmental work to confirm the significance of the feature and the limits of the feature on their lands. But that's their timing and their job, not the city's job. And this action of council is not compromising or changing that on any of the parcels.
Councillor Lehman.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Councillor Turner.
Thanks, Your Worship. Perhaps I don't know if this will be helpful or not, and I'm just going to phrase this a little bit, and perhaps through Your Worship, Mr. Barrett can confirm whether I'm right in my interpretation of this or not. Mr. Fari has an adjacent parcel, but doesn't currently have an application in front of council to develop those lands. He has designations on the land use of those parcels, and if he contested the designation of those land uses, especially the part that might be identified as ESA, it would be his responsibility to provide an environmental impact study that delineated the limits of the environmental feature and what the developable limits of that parcel would be in a completely separate process from an application that's being brought forward by Auburn. Is that correct?
Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, through your worship. Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So here's the challenge. We're getting a letter from an adjacent property owner claiming me too, but he has the opportunity to do that when he puts an application forward to develop his property. He has to do the studies. The city's not doing the studies. The applicant makes the studies. And in this circumstance, during the review, those studies, that sounds like, will be heard by the board rather than by council at this point. So it'll allow that part to occur there. But each parcel as they're developed, those property owners are responsible for their own studies. And so it's inappropriate for us to entertain the request that's being asked by Mr. Fari in this circumstance, because we don't have anything in front of us yet. When it comes in front of us at the planning committee, that's the opportunity to have that discussion, but not right now.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you. Your worship, just on a point of order.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I want to thank Councillor Turner for helping frame that, because it was helpful. I also want to I don't want to sound like I'm correcting staff. I just want to communicate to Mr. Barrett, I wasn't expecting that an EIS would be back in one cycle, simply an opportunity to meet with the landowner who communicated with us, but he has indicated that it has in fact happened. So based on those 2 points of information, at this point, I'm going to withdraw my motion to refer.
Thanks very much. Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, Councillor Hopkins. Apparently, I need confirmation from the secretary. Councillor Lehman? Or pardon me, Councillor Hillier, excuse me. I see a thumbs up, so
Confirmed.
Recognized, confirmed. Thank you very much. Councillor Hopkins, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Your Worship, and thank you, Councillor Lewis, for pulling back your deferral. I just want to make a few comments about the public participation meeting, and you're right, Councillor Lehman. This is committee work, and we did have a public participation meeting where staff did refer the Auburn lands back because of the LPAT appeal that's ongoing. I want to bring your attention as well to my colleagues that may not have watched the planning meeting, that there are also lands east of Auburn that are owned and are under the same review responsibilities as the lands to the east or to the west of of the Auburn lands too. So I think we have to be very careful if we start to pull and just support one owner in the area, that we aren't really taking into account the whole area, with the exception of the Auburn lands. I want to thank staff. I thought this was a positive recommendation coming through, mainly because this came through Civic. This is a result of the stormwater management plans. No development will take place until we do the stormwater management plans. And that was a direction given from Civic last year. And we had consultants come out, and it is our policies to implement the recommendations. And that's exactly what we're doing with the official plan amendment as a result of the EA and putting the lands into environmental review. So I will encourage everyone to support the staff recommendation. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Councilor Morgan.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. And I'll just make some comments. I know the referral's been withdrawn, but I would say it is concerning, sometimes when we get letters from landholders who have some confusion with either the process or what staff have said. And I know that the referral has been withdrawn. I appreciate what Councillor Lewis was trying to do to say, let's have our staff meet and clarify some of these. It sounds like Mr. Barrett has done that, but I think we should endeavor to do that whenever possible. And I know our staff is always willing to go out there and do that. So I think, Mr. Barrett, I appreciate that you've spent the time to try to clarify some of these points, some which, may have been, notices missed or notices in the papers missed, but also the access to the land thing you pointed out. So, I kind of always see these when someone is saying, I don't think I want another chance to clarify some of these points. And so what I wanted to say is I appreciate that you've done that. And I would certainly support you continuing to do that with both this particular landowner as well as any other in the area who wants to know exactly what is going on, what the process is, and when they might have the ability to access some of the rights that they might want to access when an application has come forward. So I will just say thanks for your work. I'm glad that the suggestion was made. I'm thankful for the discussion. I have a much better viewpoint on what's going on in this part of the city than I did before tonight's discussion. So I saw great value in this discussion. Thanks to my colleagues.
Well, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Councillor Kayadaga. Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Squire.
Sixth report of the Planning and Environment Committee. The next is the seventh report of the Planning and Environment Committee. I haven't been notified of any matters to be pulled, so unless we do, I'm happy to put the entire report on the floor.
Does anyone wish any item to be dealt with separately? I see none. Councillor Squire.
Just put the entire report on the floor.
Comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
Those are both of the planning reports, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Squire. I'll now turn us to 8.6, the eighth report of the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee. I'll call on Deputy Mayor Morgan.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have the eighth report of SPPC. I'm not aware of any items to be called separately, but I would look to colleagues to point that out to me now. Otherwise, I'm happy to put the entire report on the floor for consideration.
Does anyone wish any item to be dealt with separately? Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'd like to vote on 4.2D1 separately.
To be clear, that's the one-time grant to support RBC Place operations for the remainder of 2021 in the amount of $2.5 million, Councillor?
Right.
Thank you very much.
That's correct. D1, 4.2.
So noted. Councillor Turner.
Your worship, just in reflection, it looks like I actually recused on 5.1. So I'll ask for that to be called separately. My apologies for not identifying it at the beginning of the meeting.
And my apologies for missing that, Councillor Turner. Usually I notice those things. So I'm happy to the clerks to prepare a motion that excludes both those items and put that on the floor.
Thanks very much. So we have two items that have been pulled. Anything else that colleagues would like to have dealt with separately? So we're dealing with all issues with the exception of 4.2D1 and 5.1. Comments or questions on all but those two items? Sir, Clerk? On the advice of the clerk, we are going to pull all of item 4. Comments on the items that have not been pulled? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Deputy Mayor.
And I'm happy to put the rest of 4.2 on the floor with the exception of 4.2D1, which is the one-time operating grant to support RBC Place. We'll leave that off for now. I'll put everything else on the floor in 4.2.
Thanks, so noted. Comments or questions on all but the one item pulled, 2.21D1. I see no comments or questions. We'll call the question then.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Deputy Mayor.
Yes, and I'll now put 4.2D1, which is a one-time grant to support RBC Place operations for the remainder of 2021 in the amount of $2.5 million to be funded from the surplus. I'll put that on the floor.
Comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14-1.
Deputy.
Yes, and I'll put 5.1, which was an added item at the Committee on the City of London Services update on the floor for Councillor Turner's refusal.
Any comments or questions? I see none. We'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14 with 1 recused.
Yeah, that's it for the committee report.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'll turn to item 10, deferred matters. There are none. No inquiries of which I've been made aware. However, it has been brought to my attention that there's an emergent motion from Councillor Cassidy with respect to a request to have May 10, 2021 proclaimed Day of Action Against Anti-Asian Racism. So colleagues, we'll look for a mover and a seconder. I will tell you this is neither amendable nor debatable. Is there a mover? Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Turner. We're voting for leave. We're not voting for the amendment, just to be clear. All right, so we'll call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15 to 0.
Thank you, Your Worship, and my apologies for bringing this matter up at the last minute, but it was something that was brought to my attention on the weekend, and I was asked if I would bring this forward to council. There are starting with the month of May is Asian Heritage Month, and so it makes sense that May 10th then would be declared this day of action against anti-Asian racism. Various councils across the country have declared this day, and this local London group has asked me to bring their application forward, which I have done for consideration by council, because the next Corporate Services Committee meeting is not until May 10th. So there's no chance that this proclamation could make it to an agenda in time, hence the emergent nature of this motion. This is a day to bring awareness to this issue. It is a current and ongoing issue that unfortunately has been taking place across North America for sure, and around the world as well. In Canada itself, there has been an alarming increase in the number of incidents against Canadians of Asian heritage. And it's linked back to the COVID-19 pandemic, simply because the first case has been traced back to China. And so unfortunately, we are seeing some of this backlash hitting our Asian Canadian community, and this proclamation would show London City Council's commitment to an inclusive society, and especially to show our stand against this kind of anti-Asian hate. So I hope that City Council will support this motion.
So you're moving this, Councillor Cassidy?
Yes, Your Worship.
Do you have a seconder?
Thank you.
I think we have Deputy Mayor Morgan seconding. Colleagues, comments or questions on this? Councillor Morgan. Deputy Mayor.
Yes, so I'm obviously a seconder supportive of this motion. I did want to say the organizers who brought forward this proclamation, reading Councillor Cassidy's correspondence, are the same that organized the event on March 26th. And I will say, I wanted to take a moment to compliment them on the event that they organized. This was just a couple of weeks after a large event in Victoria Park, of which the owners or the organizers of which had since been charged for violating COVID rules. The organizers of this particular event did it in a small group in Victoria Park, properly distanced, with a large digital presence, and I think really set a good template for those who want to express and gather and support important issues like this in a responsible way that is much safer than a mass gathering. And so I wanted to not only support the motion, but compliment the organizers of that event on March 26th, because I think they did it well, and they did it right, and they did it within the rules, and they contributed to a very important cause at the same time. So I wanted to add those comments today. So, and thanks to Councillor Cassidy for bringing this as an emergent motion. I think that this was a great idea.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to, I guess, our staff, or if Councillor Cassidy is able to respond as well. My concern with this is not the principle behind it, because I think that the principle behind it is quite sound. My concern is that it's circumventing the process. And through you, I'd like to know if this organization has been vetted through the process that we would normally put proclamations through in the vetting process. Because I'm concerned that, you know, when we haven't done the vetting, we may appear to be supporting something that's very worthwhile, but there may be things that an organization is doing in the background, and I'm not saying that that is the case in this situation, but conducting themselves in ways that we might not be as supportive of. And so I'm very cautious that we're doing this without going through the proper process. Has the vetting process happened?
As I asked Councillor Cassidy, probably the most appropriate person to respond to this, I would remind the councillor and perhaps colleagues that the vetting process is on us. As you know, it goes through the clerk typically, and then from there, it's the onus is on council members to do whatever appropriate due diligence, subject to the terms of reference of the application process that does typically go through the clerk. Councillor Cassidy, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I did not spend weeks looking into the group. As I said, it came to me on the weekend, and it was I was introduced to the group by another Londoner who has been quite active in our community. I looked into the group. They have an Instagram account. They are called Stop Asian Hate London. They are a group of young people in London who are trying to do the right thing around an issue that is timely at the moment and occurring not only in London, but across the country.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, I think this one might be to our staff, but have we had other proclamations come forward or proclamation requests that came forward that we have said no to because they didn't meet the deadline for them to go through the process with the clerk's office?
I'll ask the councillor for a clarification. Are you looking for a timeline on that?
Well, I'm just wondering if we've had other applicants for proclamations who've been advised that their application was too late to make this year's deadline.
Let's go to the clerk.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, there have been some. If we're able to process it within an added agenda deadline for corporate services, we do our best to process them quicker than the 6 week. But yes, we have had some occasions where they're past the deadline, and unfortunately, the date that they're asking for proclamation would have passed by the time council dealt with it.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you. So really my concern here is a process one. It's certainly not the intent. I believe that the councillor and the people who are seeking a proclamation have good intent, but we have a proclamation process that we haven't even completed our initial review on. And I'm concerned that we're going to start circumventing that process before we've even reviewed it, when there are other ways to recognize items like this. You know, for example, we had recognition at the start of this meeting from Councillor Pelosa on Ramadan Mubarak, and I think that that's another option that we could pursue. So again, I appreciate the intent, but I'm really uncomfortable that we're circumventing the process here, because it sets a precedent for other groups to say, well, ours is timely too, and so we don't want to go through the process. We just want a councillor to bring this forward as an emergent motion. So this isn't reflective of the individuals who are asking for this or on the councillor for her intent in bringing this forward, but I'm really reluctant to support something that's not going to follow through on the process.
Thank you. I have next on the list Councillor Squire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm also concerned, and again, it has nothing to do with the merits of the application. In fact, I'm sure if this was brought in a timely manner, would have gone through staff, would have come to us and would have been approved. But I think we have to be very cautious when we set out procedures and rules for doing things, and that there's a 6 week period. because a couple of weeks ago, councilors were talking about rules, and we may not be personally happy with the way a decision went, but the rules were really important and the process was really important. And if something checked all the boxes, that was really important. And I took that to heart and actually voted a different way than I had at committee, because I accepted that argument that although I had a personal view on something in terms of a development, that I was going to stick to the rules. So what I don't want to see happen is that we start a process now where people are going to councilors saying, I've got a proclamation and I want to do it next week, and I want to take it through, I want to go outside of that administrative process and take it right to council. So in this particular case, I've been able to read the material, and so I'm satisfied. I think that this is okay. I'm breaking a rule, but I'm not as uncomfortable with that as perhaps some of my colleagues are. But I will say this, that others who come forward in the future and say, well, you did this in this case, so I'd like you to do it in this case. It shouldn't have to do really with whether we like the proclamation or we don't like the proclamation or what our personal feelings are. And so I think for me, what I'm going to do is probably support this today, although I'm very uncomfortable with it. I will be happy to see that some of my colleagues are now rule breakers along with me. So I'll know that going forward. I kind of like that. But I don't want anybody to take this as the general idea that I'm just going to say, you know what, you got something you want to get on the council floor real quick, bring it to me and I'll get it there. I'm not going to do that. And my worry is that a proclamation will come forward, someone will try to shorten the process, and we will get ourselves in trouble. We will issue a proclamation for a group that we will find out is not a group that we should support. So this is a good cause. I appreciate that going forward. But I don't think any councillor who votes against this and says, look, I'm voting against it because I don't like the procedure, should be assumed for 1 minute to not be in favor of diversity, not in favor of any of those principles. And I hope and I know that none of my colleagues would ever say that, because of course we're all in support of these type of causes and this type of diversity.
Thank you. Councillor Crabbe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for having me. Through you, I just wanted to thank the councillor for moving this motion. I did also receive it as in the same email as she did, and and I understand my colleagues weren't comfortable with overruling this process, but I just wanted to remind us that we did do that with a couple of other proclamations, and if there are any other suggestions to put out a communication that would speak against anti-Asian hate, I'm happy to support that as well. But as we don't have anything else that the councillors have proposed, I'm happy to support this motion that the councillor has put forward, because it's important and something that's been ongoing in our community for a while. The outcry has been coming to us for quite some months now. This isn't the first time that I've received communications around this specific issue, where the Asian community is targeted for hate during the pandemic. So, and this is where we come in and we take the leadership and we stand with the communities that are being targeted, and we support them. So I understand where the uncomfortableness is coming from our colleagues, but I haven't seen any other suggestions. So I'm going to support the motion that's being tabled right now. Yeah, I also was invited to their protest, and I agreed that they did a good job in respecting the rules that were in place. But again, a protest to advocate for people's lives, doesn't matter which shape or form it takes. It's important, and this is the work that we do as leaders to continue to support different community members who are being targeted for hate, for any other specific singling out. So happy to see Councillor Cassidy bring this forward, and Councillor Morgan second it. So I'll be supporting this motion. I hope my colleagues will be supporting it too.
Thank you. Councillor Elmer.
Thank you. I think it's a good idea to support the proclamation. This is why we have a section in the agenda for emergent motions, things that can't be fit into the normal timeline, because we just found out about them now, and they've just been raised at the last minute, and I think this is the appropriate way to handle it. We have lots of council policies, and we do make exceptions to them. The ones that I have very strenuously objected to are official plan policies and secondary plan policies, and they're actually quite a bit different than regular council policy, which, I mean, there's a very long list of times we've gone around and changed council policy in particular circumstances, sometimes with very good reasons. And I think this is one of those good reasons. We set out the 6-week time frame so we'd have time to consider these things. Because it's a new process, people don't really know about it. It's the first time they're applying in many cases, right? This is really the first few months where you've had it to go up and running for more than a year. And so it's really the first time people have had a chance to apply for a second time through the process that we've established. And I think people are going to, especially new organizations like this one, that have risen up to meet a particular challenge. They're not going to know what the rules are, when they're supposed to come in, and how far in advance they're supposed to know. So I think this is a good example of where you want to be accommodating, recognize that the proclamation makes sense, and just support it, because it's an important way we can show people that we're standing against this kind of anti-Asian racism. So, you know, I'm a stickler over process, but I also think that we need to be reasonable about these things. This is very clear. The benefit, I think, greatly outweighs the minor inconvenience on the process side, and I'm happy to support it. I'm glad Councillor Cassidy brought it forward.
Any other comments?
I have my hand up.
Councillor Slee, I didn't see you there, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wholeheartedly, appreciate this motion coming forward, and I strongly encourage and recommend all my colleagues today vote decisively and vote unanimously in support of this. I think I can understand sometimes the need for process and procedures, but when it comes to anti-racism or racism or human rights, we need to be decisive and we need to be clear. I'm glad Councillor Squire talked about breaking the rules on this. I think, this shouldn't be a rule that needs to be broken when it has to do with standing with those in our community who are hurting right now. The hurt isn't new. The hurt has been renewed in the past year, but Canada has a long and painful history of anti-racism against the Asian community. So we need to be decisive today. We need to stand unanimous today, regardless of the procedure. And I understand that there will be a time for us to talk about the policy down the road. And these are the conversations that could be had at this point. But today, the comments and today, our goal should be to stand with the Asian community and say to them that we hear you, we stand strongly with you, and we're going to do whatever we need to do as a community to stamp out racism. And in particular, in this case here today, stand with the Asian community. And I want to thank the mover and seconder for bringing this forward. And I want to thank those in the community for bringing this to our attention and doing the groundwork and doing the legwork. And again, to all Londoners listening, I stand with you, and this is something that we need to end. And anti-racism, anti-Asian racism is a real thing here in London. It's unfortunate, but we need to do a lot of work, and I think this is the beginning of some work on this front. So I wholeheartedly support this motion, and I encourage everyone to support it, and hopefully this could be a unanimous decision of council today.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Van Holst, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I'm happy to support this too, and I hope they have a great deal of success in making a difference and helping people realize that they may have frustrations, but there's no Canadian of any descent that is really responsible for things that happen on the other side of the oceans, or the political ideologies or actions of the rulers of countries that those people might come from. We really have to look at ourselves and make sure we're not projecting those things on there. And I understand people get frustrated when they get frustrated.
Point of order, Your Honor.
Go ahead, please, Councillor.
I just think that the comments are, the comments that the councillor is making are not relative to the motion and are getting into other people's politics, and I don't think that's what we should be discussing right now. He should go back to the motion.
Thank you. I'm sure the councillor will come back to the motion as we speak.
Thank you very much. So there we are. I encourage all Londoners to have a look when they're getting frustrated and you think someone else is is to blame for someone, think through that twice, and you realize that it may not be the case, and there's certainly more compassion, that there's lots of room for compassion, and I think that will help.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Let's call on the Deputy Mayor, please.
Yes, I'll go to the mayor.
Well, thanks very much. And colleagues, there is no one around this horseshoe that would disagree about ending racism, both within this city, across the country, and around the world. Who wouldn't? I'll be supporting the motion because I think the challenge is that in opposing it, one gives the impression that we support racism. But I do want to comment on the process, and this is, I think, where Councillor Lewis was going, in part. He talked about timing, and yet I can understand why sometimes, in some situations, timing can be a process, can be problematic. You and I know that at some point we are going to review this process because this has been our pilot project a year and a bit now, and we're learning from this. And you know, it's interesting that this has happened because we'll add this to our mix of experience as well. Here are the challenges I have, and it does, to this respect, do with timing. We know that issues around doing our due diligence in support of any proclamation, and this council has supported every proclamation that's come in front of it. And some may be more worthy than others, and that's not my place to make that comment. But what I would say is that when it's this last minute, the challenge is that we don't get to do our appropriate due diligence. And so I did have a chance to speak with the mover on this earlier today. And we spoke about two things. There are two groups that are requesting this. One is a local group, and I think it's great, but it's requested by a group from British Columbia, who I have no idea who they are, quite frankly, and I did not have an opportunity, being council day, to do any due diligence on that. I'm not casting any aspersion, I just don't know anything about them, and I'm going to guess those of us who are voting to support this would say the same thing. Second part of that is that as I look at this, it isn't a normal proclamation. This is the first, I think, that I have seen where the proclamation supports a day of action. So you know what that means, I think, by us supporting the day of action is that de facto we own all the actions that are associated with that. Bad, good, let's say they're all good, let's say they're all well-intentioned, and they're all positive, and I'm going to have to presume at this stage that they are. But by supporting, this is more than just a proclamation when we support their day of action. So we own it all, in my view. And so to me, the broadest issue is the ability of us in terms of our own collective responsibility to do our due diligence. So I'll be supporting this because even though the process is flawed, because we haven't had a chance to do the due diligence, I agree with Councillor Salee and all the others who have talked in terms of us taking appropriate steps to end racism in our community and across the country. Thanks, Deputy Mayor. Go ahead, Councillor Squire.
Mr. Mayor, I can't remain sitting. In the beginning of your remarks, you said that if someone did not support this motion, they could be assumed to be supporting racism. I can't remain seated when someone says that. To suggest that someone, and it's not going to be me, I'm going to support the proclamation, but for the mayor of the City of London to suggest that if someone does not vote a particular way, they might be seen as a racist is not something that should be said.
So noted and withdrawn. Thank you. Other comments or questions? Thanks very much. We'll call the question.
I was logged out of the system, but I'm voting yes, Councillor Salee.
Thank you, Councillor.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thanks very much. We will now turn to the bylaws, colleagues. And as you know, and for the benefit of the public, one of the things we'll be doing is after these bylaws have been dealt with, we will then go into closed session, return back to public session, and complete the meeting. So with that, colleagues, we have bills numbers 177 through 125 inclusive, with the exception of Bill 191, which is a conflict as declared by Councillor Turner. So what I'll be looking for is a mover and seconder for introduction and first reading of those bills. Is there a mover, please? Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Van Meerbruggen. We call the vote.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Colleagues, I'll look for mover of bills 177 through 225 with the exception of Bill 191. Councillor Lehman moved, seconded by no one. Anyone? Councillor Cassidy, thank you very much. Any discussion? Call the question.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
I'll now look for a move and enactment of bills 177 through 225, exempting Bill 191, moved by Councillor Pelosi, seconded by Councillor Van Meerbruggen. Thank you. We call the vote.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Colleagues, on now one, I'll look for mover and seconder for introduction and first reading. Councillor Lehman, seconded by Councillor Lewis. Call the vote, please.
Councillor Turner, thank you. Closing the vote and the motion carries 14 with 1 recused.
For second reading of bill and seconder, please. Mover by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Thank you very much. Any discussion? We'll call the vote.
Councillor Lehman, closing the vote and the motion carries 14 with 1 recused.
Call third reading enactment of Bill 181, moved by Councillor Pelosi, seconded by Councillor Helmer. We'll call the vote.
Councillor Helmer, closing the vote and the motion carries 14 with 1 recused.
I'm going to go into closed session, deal with some items, and then return back to public session. For this purpose, I'm going to ask the clerk just to indicate the items that we're going to deal with.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're going into closed session to discuss 4 matters, 2 of which are property acquisition matters. One is a personal matter about identifiable individual, and the last is a litigation matter.
So I'll look for a mover and seconder to go into closed session. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Pelosi. Thank you. We will call the question.
Councillor Kaibaga? Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
So I'll ask for your indulgence of rearranging to move into closed session. Thank you.